The church within a church. Something of a surprise. An 18th century church in a 20th century suburb. Welcome to St Mary and St Margaret's, the Parish Church of Castle Bromwich. We're a lively 21st century congregation, taking part in a wide range of religious and social activities. We're a 21st century congregation, but we worship in a church with a long and intriguing history. Architect Charles Bateman lived nearby in Rectory Lane. In 1893, he wondered how such a church came to be built, with Renaissance columns and arches, more associated with a town site than for a country district, which Castle Bromwich certainly was at the time it was built. And there is more to St Mary and St Margaret's than meets the eye. We call it the church within a church. St Mary and St Margaret's is a well-preserved 18th century church. Inside, inscriptions read, "This chapel was begun to be rebuilt in the year of our Lord 1726 and finished in the year 1731. This was early in the reign of King George II. The rebuilding was paid for by wealthy barrister Sir John Bridgeman II, who lived at the adjacent Castle Bromwich Hall. Born at Castle Bromwich in 1667, the year after the Great Fire of London, Sir John studied law at the Inner Temple in London, and would have been well aware of the classical rebuilding of the capital and of the many Renaissance-style churches built in London by Sir Christopher Wren after the fire. A classical London-style church would certainly grace his country seat in rural Castle Bromwich. From 1710, over a 15-year period, Sir John Bridgeman extended and improved Castle Bromwich Hall in the fashion of the day. When the hall was almost complete, Sir John called on architect Thomas White of Worcester to design a new church to match his improved hall. Thomas White was a former pupil of Sir Christopher Wren. Over 5 years, the church was rebuilt in a classical style, inspired by Wren's London churches. The village church now served as the Bridgeman Family Chapel, a town church in the country. St Mary and St Margaret's is an early Georgian church with typical 18th century features. Built in fashionable red brick, it is trimmed with sandstone around the windows and doors and at the corners of the building. The round arched doorways are topped with a classical triangular feature known as a pediment. As with Wren's London churches, the windows are large and round arched, with stone decorations above and below. Classical urns stand at the corners of the tower. The church has a little altered 18th century interior, typical of English churches of the time. Little altered because Sir John's son Orlando married Lady Anne Newport, heiress of Weston Park. In 1762, their son Henry inherited that much grander house and estate, establishing it as the family seat. Castle Bromwich Hall was then rented out, and other than general maintenance, nothing further was done to the church. Castle Bromwich was left frozen in time. The main body of the church, the nave, has a central aisle and side aisles joined to it by arcades of classical Doric pillars. Unusually, St Mary and St Margaret's retains its 18th century box pews. The triple-decker pulpit is a rare surviving 18th century feature, reflecting the Protestant emphasis on preaching as against the celebration of the Mass. Any self-respecting lord had their family pews set apart from the congregation. The squire's pews in the chancel bear the arms of Sir John Bridgeman II, Baronet. Medieval churches were open to the rafters and cold and draughty. For warmth and comfort, the Georgians sealed their church roofs. The West Gallery was built later, at the end of the 18th century, probably for the installation of the organ. It's an early example of the use of cast iron pillars in a church. At the east end is the chancel, with the altar where Holy Communion takes place. The chancel is unusually large for a church of this period. It is more highly decorated than the nave, with more elaborate plasterwork. The communion rails of scrolled ironwork bear the royal arms of King George II, unusually placed in such a central position. Tablets are inscribed with the Creed and the Ten Commandments. In 1869, there were Bridgmans again at Castle Bromwich Hall, with the marriage of the Earl of Bradford's eldest son, George Bridgman, to Lady Ida Lumley. The couple were the first of the family to live here for over 100 years and raised 7 children here. They were prompted to restore the church in 1893 on the occasion of the wedding of Lady Ida's friend, Princess May of Teck, to the Duke of York, later King George V, at St James's Palace in London. A new bell was added to the old ring of 5. It is inscribed, "I celebrate the wedding day of George of York and Princess May, 1893. A restoration and a surprise discovery. George Bridgman entrusted the restoration to Charles Bateman, the noted architect who was born and raised and lived in Castle Bromwich. Sympathetic repairs and alterations were made to the church building during 1893. Gas lights were installed and a central heating system which is still in use. Other 19th century additions include stained glass windows, most of them Bridgman memorials. St Mary and St Margaret's remained, however, a typical Georgian church. But as he sat in church Sunday by Sunday, architect Charles Bateman noticed something very odd. The columns of the arcades do not line up between the windows. They block the windows, something no classical architect would have designed, let alone a pupil of Sir Christopher Wren. Bateman was perplexed. During the restoration, Bateman inspected the condition of the roof. He climbed a ladder through the trapdoor and into the roof space. He could make out the timbers of the slender 18th century trusses. And then, a surprise. Further into the darkness were very large square trusses. Charles Bateman had discovered the massive timbers of a medieval roof, some 300 years older than the church itself. Inside the church, the pillars must also be medieval, measuring some 23 feet in height and shaved from their original square cross-section to circular. These ancient timbers still support the massive medieval roof today. Bateman had discovered something unique in an English church, an 18th century brick church built around a 15th century timber frame, a church within a church. Bateman then understood why the pillars do not line up between the windows. 18th century architect Thomas White was trying to fit a Renaissance-style church around a medieval timber frame with very different measurements and proportions. Charles Bateman now turned his attention to the chancel, which was much larger than usual for a church of this period. He wrote, "I examined the side wall of the chancel, and under the wood panelling a stone wall was exposed to view. I think that this was the original chapel, built even before the timber nave. There's further evidence outside. The footings of the nave are of 18th century brick, while the footings of the chancel are sandstone blocks, the remains of the ancient chapel." And there's more. This picture of Castle Bromwich Hall was drawn in 1726, as rebuilding the church had just begun. The tower and the nave are shown as built, but the chancel is not. Instead of 2 large windows, 2 small windows are shown with a priest's door between, and the chancel is built of stone. This is the original chapel, left in place when the timber-framed church was built about 1450. It seems it was intended to be left intact for the 1726 rebuild, but was actually encased in brick with the rest of the old church. And that explains the unusually large chancel. It was not built as a chancel in the 18th century. It was actually built as a small stone chapel some 900 years ago, built by the lord of the manor, one of the de Bromwich family, the Norman lord of the tiny Anglo-Saxon hamlet of Castle Bromwich. There is then more to St Mary and St Margaret's Church than meets the eye. It is a fine example of a Renaissance-style 18th century church, a town church in the country. But within the brickwork of 1731 is a substantial medieval timber frame dating from the 15th century. And hidden within the chancel is the stone wall of a 12th century chapel. This really is the church within a church. It's quite a thought that when we receive Holy Communion here, we do so in the same place that the people of Castle Bromwich have done for over 900 years.